Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, your mind screaming, "Stop!" But your legs step out into the empty air anyway. Welcome, shadow dwellers. Tonight I'm telling you 3 disturbing Appalachian Mountains horror stories. Mysterious orbs that hypnotize you into the void. A hunter who tracks you for sport. And a meal that kills from the inside out. If you're alone right now, you might not want to be. Let's begin. The map lied. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate gap. If you looked at the official Forest Service map for the Linville Gorge, the campsite numbers jumped. They went from 22 straight to 24. The rangers just acted like the woods in between didn't exist. But the forest knew better. Jax knew too. He worked construction, the kind of guy who didn't trust anything he couldn't take apart. He dug the coordinates out of an old forum where people traded warnings about the gorge. He wanted to find the hollow space. He wanted to know why they erased it. Jax drove. Mila and Ben were with him. They parked at the trailhead and headed into the brush. The laurels here were a wall. The branches tangled together like rusted wire. They tore at their jeans with the sound of ripping canvas. Every step was a fight. The wood felt stiff, fighting back, trying to push them toward the main trail. They broke through after an hour. The air changed instantly. It felt thin. It felt dry, like the air inside an attic that hasn't been opened in 50 years. They were in a small clearing. In the center sat a fire ring, rusted entirely through. It looked like a jagged metal mouth sticking out of the dirt. Just beyond it, half buried in the mud, was a piece of yellow plastic tape. You could barely read the faded black letters. Sight closed. Ben stopped dead. He rubbed the back of his neck. It wasn't the cold, it was the silence. The gorge is loud. You always hear the river or the wind. But here, nothing. It was a vacuum. The silence pressed against Ben's eardrums until he felt them pop, like he was driving up a mountain too fast. "We're here," Jax whispered. His voice sounded flat, like he was speaking inside a closet full of coats. The trees swallowed the sound instantly. They set up camp. Nobody talked much. A low static pressure began to fill the air. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears. It was a sensation you felt in your teeth. It sat in the marrow of Ben's bones, shaking steadily like a heavy truck idling nearby. Night fell hard. Darkness in the gorge is absolute. At exactly 11 p.m., the first anomaly arrived. Ben saw it first. He was staring into the tree line, trying to ignore the shaking in his jaw. Then a light appeared. It drifted out from the black trunks. It wasn't a flashlight. It was a sphere, the size of a grapefruit. It pulsed with a rhythmic beat. It glowed with a sickly white gold light. It didn't flicker like a flame. It expanded and contracted. It was breathing. The air shifted. The smell hit them hard. It smelled like ozone and burnt plastic, the smell of a blown fuse. It made Ben's eyes water. "Look," Ben choked out. The orb hovered. It didn't drift like a ghost. It sat there, perfectly still, fixed in space. It felt cold. It felt like a camera lens. It was watching them, recording them, waiting for something specific. Daylight brought no relief. The sun looked gray through the canopy. The pressure didn't stop. It got stronger. By the second night, their heads weren't working right. Logic started to break down. Mila woke up to the sound of dragging. She sat up. The tent zipper screamed in the quiet night. She shined her light outside. Ben was standing at the edge of the woods. He was barefoot in the freezing mud. He was staring right into the black trees. "Ben," Mila whispered. He didn't move. He stood as still as a concrete piling. Mila scrambled out. She grabbed his arm. His skin was ice. It felt unnatural, like touching a stone wall in winter. Ben turned his head slowly. His eyes were wrong. The pupils were blown wide open, swallowing the color. He looked drugged. He looked empty. "They're waiting," Ben whispered. He didn't remember walking over there, but looking past him, Mila saw them. The Orbs. There were 3 of them now. They hovered in a triangle formation just outside the light. They pulsed in perfect unison. They were closer than the night before. By the 3rd night, they stopped talking. They didn't eat. The trio sat in their camp chairs, lined up in a row facing the cliff edge. They sat there like they were waiting for a show to start. The pressure grew into a roar. It sounded like a waterfall crashing inside their skulls. It drowned out their own thoughts. They weren't campers anymore. They were witnesses. The orbs multiplied. They floated around the camp. The white gold light washed over their faces, making them look pale and waxy. Every time Ben tried to blink, the light seemed to skip forward. He blinked and they were 10 feet away. He blinked again and they were 5 feet away. The air smelled like a lightning strike. Then came the final night. The behavior of the lights changed. They stopped drifting. They moved with sudden mechanical purpose. 5 spheres lined up. They drifted out over the void. They hovered there, suspended over the 50-foot drop. There was no bridge. There was no path. Just the empty air and the lights waiting in the dark. Jack stood up. His movements were jerky, wrong, like a marionette being pulled by strings. His face was totally blank. No fear, no peace, just nothing. He walked to the edge. Ben tried to yell, but his throat was locked. He was paralyzed. The static pressure held him down in the chair like a vice. He couldn't move a finger. He could only watch. Jax didn't hesitate. He stepped off the cliff. Gravity took him instantly. He dropped into the black. No scream, no flailing, just gone. Thud. The sound of him hitting the rocks below was wet, heavy. Mila stood up next. She didn't look at Ben. She didn't look at the camp. Her eyes were locked on the orbs. She walked to the edge. She stepped out. She vanished into the dark. Crack. The sound of her body hitting the bottom echoed up the ravine. Ben was alone. The orbs flared brighter. They burned white hot. Then Ben stood up. He didn't want to. His brain was screaming no. But his legs moved anyway. He was a passenger in his own body. The pull was magnetic. It dragged him toward the edge. He walked to the cliff. He looked down. He saw the black emptiness. He knew he was going to die. The orbs pulsed. Come. Ben's leg lifted. He stepped out into the air. The world tilted. The wind rushed past his ears. Then darkness. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was rhythmic, digital. Ben opened his eyes. White ceiling tiles, the smell of antiseptic. He wasn't on the cliff. He was in a bed with rails. Tubes ran into his arm. His legs were in casts, hoisted up on pulleys. His jaw was wired shut. A nurse walked in. She dropped her clipboard when she saw his eyes open. "He's awake!" she yelled. Ben tried to move. Pain exploded everywhere. He panicked. He thrashed, fighting the restraints. The ranger came in an hour later. He held a thick file. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "We found you at the bottom of the ravine," the ranger said. "You've been in a coma for 4 days." Ben tried to speak through the wires. The ranger held up a hand. "Your friends didn't make it. The fall killed them on impact." The ranger leaned in close. His voice dropped to a whisper. "We don't know how you survived, son. And we don't know why you did it. There were no slip marks, no signs of a struggle. You 3 just lined up and walked off the edge. Ben closed his eyes. He saw the orbs. He saw Jax stepping into nothing. The report said it was a tragedy, a group delusion, a suicide pact. They closed the file. They put up new barriers around the trailhead. They told the public it was for soil erosion. But here is the thing they won't put in the brochure. You think Ben was crazy. The Fed's own files admit that 5% of these things defy physics. Half of those are metallic orbs, just like the ones in the gorge. These aren't swamp gas. Cameras at Appalachian State have been filming them since the 1700s. Lights that hover for 20 minutes before vanishing. Search and rescue teams know the pattern, even if they won't say it. They find bodies at the bottom of cliffs in impossible spots. No struggle, no slip marks. The data shows a straight-line travel pattern. Lost hikers usually wander in circles, but in these cases, they walk with purpose. They walk in a straight line, directly toward the hazard. The lights don't show you a bridge. They don't have to. They just reach into your brain and turn off the part that keeps you alive. They call you to them. So if you're camping in the Blue Ridge and you see a golden glow, close your eyes, zip the tent. Because once they have your attention, your feet aren't yours anymore. And by the time you realize you're walking on air, it's already too late. If you're still here after that first encounter, you're my kind of horror addict. Shadow dwellers. Like the video and subscribe so you don't have to face the next 2 stories alone. The second encounter takes us to the Devil's Elbow in 1997, where Star realizes the man circling her tent isn't trying to kill them quickly. He is hunting her and her girlfriend purely for the sport. The Appalachian Mountains in October are a place of silence and rot. It was 1997, a year when isolation was absolute. There were no cell towers in the Devil's Elbow. Star and Jessica were miles from the nearest paved road, relying on Motorola StarTAC phones that were nothing more than dead weight in their packs. 0 bars, no signal, just the crushing weight of the mountain shadows. They set up camp as the sun died behind the ridge. The tent was a simple dome with fiberglass poles that groaned like old bones whenever the wind kicked up. That low, rhythmic creaking was the only thing they could hear for hours. Then, the darkness swallowed everything. It started with a noise that didn't belong to the woods. A sharp, metallic strike rang out against a tree trunk. Star froze. She held her breath, her eyes locking onto Jessica's in the dim gloom of the tent. The sound came again. Harder this time, metal hitting wood. Jessica reached for the flashlight, but Star grabbed her wrist, shaking her head. She knew instinctively that they needed to stay dark. Outside, heavy boots crushed the dry leaves. These weren't the erratic shuffles of a squirrel or the heavy thud of a bear. These were footsteps, deliberate, slow. One step, then a pause, then another step. The sound came from directly behind the tent. A beam of light hit the rainfly. It wasn't the bright white LED beam we are used to today. It was a sickly, yellowish incandescence, the kind that comes from an old, heavy-duty maglite. Through the thin nylon fabric, the beam looked like a diseased eye. It had a dark, hollow spot in the center. The light didn't scan the trees. It didn't look for a path. It was focused entirely on their tent. The beam moved slowly. It traced the seams of the fabric with the steady hand of a surgeon examining an incision. It slid up the zipper line, paused at the toggle, and then moved down to the floor. The footsteps resumed. The person outside was walking in a perfect, tight circle around them. Star felt her heart hammering against her ribs, a physical pain in her chest. She reached into the side pocket of her pack, and wrapped her fingers around a small canister of pepper spray. It was a weak 10% blend, hardly enough to stop a determined attacker, but it was the only weapon they had. The footsteps stopped. The yellow light vanished. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. The wind had died. The fiberglass poles stopped groaning. The silence was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Then the air shattered. A sudden, jagged burst of static erupted right beside the tent wall. It was the harsh hiss of a handheld CB radio being keyed. The speaker was inches from Star's head. Just a thin sheet of nylon separated her ear from the device. A voice whispered through the white noise. It sounded like sandpaper sliding over stone. Visual contact confirmed. Star's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't asking a question. It was a report. The radio clicked off, plunging them back into silence. Then the static burst again. Star is resting. Jessica is awake. Jessica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The man wasn't just watching them. He knew their names. How long had he been there? How long had he been listening to them talk before he made his presence known? The radio clicked off. The heavy boots crunched again, resuming their slow, hypnotic orbit around the tent. He wasn't trying to get in. He was patrolling them, keeping them contained. "We have to go," Star whispered, the words barely forming on her lips. "Now." They didn't pack. They didn't grab the stove or the sleeping bags. Survival instinct took over, primal and sharp. Star gripped the zipper of the tent door. She counted to 3 in her head. She ripped the zipper down. The mechanism let out a high-pitched whine as the door fell open. They dove out into the freezing October air. The cold hit them like a physical blow. They scrambled to their feet, their boots sliding on the slick layer of dead leaves. Star fumbled for the whistle around her neck. She blew it, hard. A piercing two-tone shriek echoed off the canyon walls. It was a desperate plea for help designed to carry for miles through the gaps. Jessica blew hers a second later. The dual sound cut through the night. They didn't look back. They bolted toward the blue blaze trail, their headlamps cutting frantic, bouncing arcs through the blackness. Tree branches whipped their faces. Roots tried to snag their ankles. They ran until their lungs burned, fueled by pure adrenaline. But as they rounded a bend, the beam of Star's headlamp swept across a gnarled oak tree. She skidded to a halt. Jessica slammed into her back. "Oh, God," Jessica sobbed. There he was. He stood perfectly still, framed by the dark timber. He wore a bright orange hunting vest that seemed to glow in the LED light. He wasn't chasing them. He wasn't running. He was just standing there. He held the radio to his chest like a holy relic. His face was a mask of indifference, his eyes catching the light with a dull, flat reflection. He didn't move a muscle. He didn't speak. He just watched them run. It was the stillness that was worse than any aggression. It was the patience of a predator who knows he doesn't have to chase his prey. They ran. They ran until the forest swallowed them whole, until the orange vest was a memory, until their legs gave out at the trailhead as the gray light of dawn broke over the peaks. They found a ranger station and collapsed on the steps. But the horror didn't end with their escape. It only deepened when the official report came back. Rangers hiked back to the Devil's Elbow to recover the abandoned gear. The tent was still there, zipped open, flapping in the wind. But near the campsite, hidden in a thicket of rhododendrons just 10 yards away, the Rangers found something else. They called it a cold seat. It was a spot on the forest floor where the layers of dry, crunchy leaves had been meticulously cleared away by hand, exposing the damp, silent earth beneath. It was a perfect circle, just big enough for a man to sit. It allowed someone to sit there for hours, shifting their weight, watching the campsite, without making a single sound. He had been there long before they heard the metallic clink against the tree. He had been there when they set up the tent. He had been there when they ate dinner. He had been there when they said each other's names. The man was later identified by locals as a hermit who lived deep in the gaps. He didn't hunt animals. He enjoyed testing his tracking skills. He enjoyed the hunt of fear. And that was where the nightmare truly settled in. The Rangers told Star and Jessica the truth. There was nothing they could do. He hadn't touched them. He hadn't verbally threatened to kill them. He had simply stood in the woods. He had simply watched. In the eyes of the law, he had committed no crime. He was free to go back to his gap, back to his cold seats, to wait for the next campers to wander into his circle. The mountain is big. The woods are deep. But for Star and Jessica, the feeling of that circle, the heavy crunch of boots, the hiss of the radio, and the knowledge that he is still out there, legally untouchable, never truly went away. That hunter was playing a sick game, but at least they could run away. This final story, there is no running. This time the danger isn't a stranger hiding in the trees. It's the friend standing right next to the campfire. We go deep into the Appalachian backcountry, where Waylon is forced to face the sick reality that he is a silent Mary, a walking factory for disease. The sound was rhythmic and sharp. Waylon's metal ladle scraped against the side of the heavy cast-iron pot. It was the first night of a 15-day deep excursion into the Appalachian backcountry. The steam rising from the beef stew smelled rich and salty. Waylon was focused. He wanted the seasoning to be perfect. He lifted the heavy ladle to his lips. He took a long, thoughtful sip, letting the broth wash over his tongue to check for salt. He swallowed, satisfied. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he plunged that same ladle back into the bubbling pot. He gave it a vigorous stir, mixing his own saliva deep into the communal meal. To him, it was just cooking. Waylon felt country tough. He had just spent 6 months backpacking through rural Asia, eating from street carts and drinking from questionable taps. He believed his gut was made of iron. He believed he was invincible. But he was wrong. He didn't know that deep inside his body a colony of microscopic killers was waking up. Salmonella typhi, typhoid. It was living in his system, thriving in his gut. When he put that spoon back into the pot, he wasn't just seasoning the food. He was loading a weapon. A twig snapped in the darkness just beyond the firelight. No one looked up. They were too focused on the smell of the food. Waylon served them, one by one, using the same spoon he had just licked clean. Walker, the team leader, declared it the best start to a trip yet. Braxton, the youngest, smiled weakly. He had a compromised immune system and was the one they all looked out for. But he wanted to prove he could handle the deep woods. He took the bowl from Waylon. He ate every bite. Waylon watched them eat. He felt fine. He had no idea that the biological timer had just started ticking. The first week was a deception. The green tunnel of the Appalachians swallowed them whole, and for a few days, it was paradise. The air was crisp. The hiking was good. But slowly, the cracks began to show. It started with the small things. Around day 4, the jokes around the campfire stopped being quite so loud. Walker mentioned his stomach felt off, blaming the freeze-dried chili mac. Then came the sickness. Gage and Walker spent more time away from camp than in it. They were pale, sweating, and battling severe cramping. But in the woods, you rationalize everything. It was just trail gut. It was the altitude. They popped pills and pushed on. Waylon felt superior. His stomach was solid. He watched his friends clutching their abdomens and shook his head, telling them to toughen up. He didn't realize that the bacteria was multiplying in their intestines, burrowing into the lining of their gut, doubling its numbers every 20 minutes. Day 8 arrived, the pivotal day. They had hiked to a remote zone to meet a supply truck at a logging road crossing. It was a grueling 5-hour uphill scramble. They met the driver, got their fresh packs, and laughed about how soft the real world looked. But then, they had to turn around and hike 5 hours back into the deep woods. By the time they reached their base camp again, they were destroyed. The physical exertion had drained them completely. Their immune systems, already fighting a silent battle, crashed. That was exactly what the killer was waiting for. The bacteria had been incubating, building its forces. Now, the incubation period was over. That night, the atmosphere of the camp shifted violently. The comfort was gone. The wind began to moan through the high pines, a low mourning sound that signaled a storm. But the storm inside Braxton was worse. He sat on a mossy log, clutching his temples. His knuckles were white. He whispered that it felt like an ice pick was being driven into his skull. Waylon thought Braxton was just crashing from the exertion. He didn't know that Braxton's immune system had been overrun. The bacteria had breached the bloodstream. The storm hit hard, pinning them in the tents. Braxton stopped moving. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. Walker tried to check on him but stumbled, grabbing the tent pole for support, muttering about being dizzy. The healthy men, Walker and Gage, had strong systems. They were sick, but they could fight it for weeks. Braxton didn't have weeks. He didn't even have days. Walker pulled back Braxton's damp shirt. Gage gasped. On Braxton's chest, faint, rose-colored spots were blooming. They looked like a rash of blood rising to the surface. It was the mark of the infection taking total control. Pinned inside the small tents, the traps snapped shut. The resupply point was a 5-hour hard hike away. In this weather, it might as well have been on the moon. The weight of helplessness began to crush them. Braxton began to mutter. It started low, a strained, desperate whisper. He wasn't talking to his friends anymore. He was arguing with shadows. The fever was boiling his brain. Suddenly, he screamed. He yelled that they were in the trees. His voice tore through the sound of the drumming rain. A flash of lightning lit up the tent. For a second, the world was stark white. Braxton's eyes were wide, unblinking. He stared at nothing. He lunged for the tent zipper, trying to escape a monster that only he could see. Then, just as fast as he moved, he stopped. His body went rigid, like a board. He collapsed backward. His eyes stayed open, staring at the tent ceiling but seeing nothing. He had fallen into the typhoid state. His body was there, but Braxton was gone. In the neighboring tent, Walker fumbled with the satellite messenger. His hands shook so bad he dropped it. The device emitted the high-pitched tone of failure. The storm clouds blocked the signal. The smell inside the tent changed. It wasn't just sweat anymore. It was cloying and metallic. It was the scent of internal sickness. It smelled like damp earth and old pennies. Outside, Waylon sat dry under a lean-to. He felt a little tired, maybe a slight headache, but he was functioning. He scraped the bottom of the stew pot again. The metal shrieked like a wounded animal. He muttered to himself that they were soft, that they couldn't hack the deep woods. He sat there, oblivious, the architect of their ruin. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally broke, the silence was heavy. Final. Search and rescue finally hiked into the clearing after the group missed their check-in. They found a camp of ghosts. They found Walker and Gage curled in the mud, barely breathing. And they found Braxton. He was cold. He hadn't made it through the night. In the sterile white light of the hospital, the mystery was solved. The CDC confirmed it. It was a rare strain of typhoid, a traveler's variety from across the world. Wayland stood in the hallway, confused. He told the doctor his blood tests were clean. The doctor looked at him with cold, hard eyes. He explained that while Wayland's blood was clean, his other samples were blazing positive. He was a chronic carrier. Wayland froze. The realization hit him harder than the storm. He hadn't just brought back memories from his trip to Asia. He had brought back a hitchhiker. He thought back to the very first night. He remembered lifting the ladle. He remembered tasting the broth. And he remembered putting the spoon back in. He had carried the killer in his gut for 2 weeks. He had watched it slowly murder his friend. Wayland survived. But his mind bears a scar that will never heal. He has to live with the knowledge that his hands were the instruments of their end. But the most terrifying part isn't Wayland's guilt. It's the reality that created it. Doctors call people like Wayland silent Marys. They are walking factories for disease. They feel 100% healthy, yet their bodies are shedding millions of infectious killers every single day. And they are everywhere, working in kitchens, prepping salad bars, handing you your food. Think about the last meal you didn't cook yourself. Think about the person who made it. Did they wash their hands? Did they scrub under their fingernails? Or did they walk straight from the bathroom stall to the stove? You don't get typhoid from bad luck. You get it because you ate a microscopic piece of a stranger. So the next time someone offers you a home-cooked meal or hands you a plate at a barbecue, take a good look at their hands, because you never know what they're carrying in their blood. If you're planning a camping trip after hearing this, you're braver than I am. Shadow dwellers, if you want more Appalachian nightmares, you know where to find me. Until next time, trust your fear.